Good evening, Range of Beauties, and welcome to the Pink Politics Show. Each year, a bogus Newsweekly magazine that's transitioned to an online publication called U.S. News and World Report provides a list of the best colleges in the country. This internet-based publication's owner, Mortimer Zuckerman, says that the purpose of the education rankings is to help parents and students find the quote-unquote perfect school. Now, I'm sure you're not surprised that Harvard University, the oldest so-called higher education institution in the United States, is usually ranked as one of the top 2 Ivy League schools. For example, Harvard's rankings in the 2020 edition of Best Colleges is number 2, trailing only Princeton University, which came in first. At first glance, Harvard University comes across as being devoted to excellence in teaching, learning, and research, and to developing leaders in many disciplines who make a difference globally. But upon closer inspection, Harvard is not as good as it seems. In fact, it produces people who are extremely dumb and dangerously so. Mainstream pundits and journalists over at CNN and MSNBC are told to downplay or forget or make light of just how incompetent these Harvard alumni who win seats in Congress really are. So you probably haven't realized that every day they're actually heard saying or seen doing something that's not so smart. Democratic Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer, for example, said this following the travel ban some years ago.
This executive order was mean-spirited and un-American.
Un-American. Needless to say, I was at a loss for words and thought. Is he being his unhumorous self, or is he serious? Oh, and by the way, who was his U.S. history teacher at Harvard? Was it a professor whose first name was Lying and last name Myth? Or maybe Schumer was just a bad student who got promoted because his parents did what Lori Loughlin and Felicity Huffman did. Maybe Schumer's mom and pop paid money to get his history grade changed from an F- to an A+. Okay, so maybe I'm splitting hairs, but whatever the case may be, it's well known that there was a lot of antagonism toward immigrant groups who sought to get a piece of the American pie that our ancestors were forced to bake. Now, we could give you a million examples of this, but we're just going to give you a few because they make the point. Here's one. In May 1882, the United States Senate and the United States House of Representatives passed the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which prohibited all immigration of Chinese opportunists who were seeking to gain a portion of the wealth created by our ancestors during their enslavement. That law was the first significant law restricting immigration into the United States, but it certainly wasn't the last. Which brings us to our second example. In May of 1924, the United States Senate and the United States House of Representatives passed another law that limited the number of immigrants allowed entry into the United States through a national origins quota. That law is known as the Immigration Act of 1924. These type of acts that contradict what Schumer said really makes me wonder, what was the American history book that he and his classmates were required to read? Now, if I had to, I'd guess that the name of the book was The Politically Correct Guide to American History. But Schumer isn't the only moron who's sitting in Congress with a dopey Harvard degree. There are countless others out there just waiting to be handpicked by Money Mike Bloomberg and Tom the Wall Street Swindler Steyer as the next Democratic presidential candidate. And speaking of the office of president, Barack Obama is another Harvard grad who's ignorant of our country's immigration history. Here's a clip of him saying historically inaccurate stuff.
My fellow Americans, tonight I'd like to talk with you about immigration. For more than 200 years, our tradition of welcoming immigrants from around the world has given us a tremendous advantage over other nations.
For more than 200 years, our tradition of welcoming immigrants from around the world has given us a tremendous advantage over other nations. Huh? So he must have read that same book that Schumer had to read while at Harvard. And by the way, Obama was not done rewriting history and using his fictitious narrative to justify the soft genocide that he and his fellow Democrats are committing against Black Americans. Watch and repeat one of the most pervasive and dangerous myths about immigrants that the Democrats ever created.
My fellow Americans, we are and always will be a nation of immigrants.
My fellow Americans, we are and always will be a nation of immigrants. No, Barry. The United States of America was never, is not, and will never be a nation of immigrants. Historically speaking, the United States is a nation of two distinct groups. White Americans who are descended primarily from an English population who colonized and enslaved, and Black Americans who are descended from various African populations who were enslaved. Now, don't get me wrong, I know that the American Indian people are still here, but I didn't include them as one of the nation's founding group of peoples because they're descended from people who were, for the most part, semi-independent nations, as they generally lived in communities separate from the English who colonized and brutalized them, and Black Americans who sympathized with them. Now, let's get back to Obama. Again, we have to ask, what is this ignorant Harvard miseducated fool talking about? This Democratic stooge needs to give the Middle Eastern deity who he believes created him, Allah, bat those big ears because he obviously doesn't use them to listen. You know, I don't expect him to know Black American history. His father, after all, was an African Muslim from a country that the English created called Kenya. I'm sure he's more familiar with the history of the Maasai tribe than he is with the history of his wife Michelle Obama's people. His family is steeped in tradition when it comes to lion hunting, and Obama has had plenty of advice from his father's male relatives on how to kill them with the spear. But not knowing our community's history is no excuse to lie. Just simply say that you're more knowledgeable of the Maasai's history than you are of Black American history. And if Harvard University doesn't raise its academic standards and begin teaching its students facts and not myths, then it should be purchased from the two boards who currently determine its future policies and plans by a responsible group of investors. These investors should then fire the current faculty members of the university and replace them with professors who will teach the facts about this country. Thank you for joining us. I'm Taylor Washington, and this is Pink Politics, where Black womanhood and politics converge.